The Beatitude, I'll just turn right to it. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And we had I thought it was a fun discussion last week, talking about this purity of heart and trying to wrap our arms around it. And as I was sharing last Sunday, it can be a challenge in the sense that it's not something that you can grasp intellectually. It's a purity of heart is not something you pick up a textbook and say, okay, here's what purity of heart is. I'm going to go do that. It's a life. It's an experience of heart. It's deeper and more than just words on a page, and so that was interesting. Susan asked a question last week that I thought was interesting. In fact, she made a couple of comments that I thought were interesting, and we were talking about later during our small group discussion Sunday night. One of the comments that she talked about, we were talking about our different personalities, and she was talking about how she is more of a feeler in her relationship with Christ, and that's wonderful. I'm not here to denigrate that at all. And some of us, including myself, are more stoic and more Spock-like, live long and prosper, and we're trying to sort this all out. And the thing that surprised me as she was sharing last week was that she was sharing about how much she struggles with being a feeler, how much she struggles with being emotional in her relationship. And that made me ponder, because I struggle with being unemotional. And we talked about that in our small group last Sunday as we were just gathering around the goodies. And I made the comment to her, I said, you know what, what's weird is that no matter where you are on this emotion logic spectrum, you think you're the weird one. And she agreed. It was just kind of a strange phenomenon that I had never really thought of. You know, if you're in church and you're raising your hands, you think everybody's looking at you because you're raising your hands. And if you're at church like me and you're not raising your hand, you think everybody's looking at you because you're not raising your hands. No matter where you fit in this spectrum, you think you're the weird one.
I was just going to say, or the unspiritual one.
Or the unspiritual one. Yeah, I mean, never forget that the name Satan means adversary, accuser. And he loves to make us feel like wherever we are in this spectrum of our experience with Christ, that we're the one that's on the out looking in, that everybody else has it together and we're the weird ones. And that was just kind of an interesting insight. And she said that she was thinking the same things throughout the day on Sunday. So that was one of the things. But then she also asked the question, when Jesus here says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And she was wondering if that seeing God was sort of like how Moses was asking to see God in the Old Testament. And so I did do a little digging, not a whole lot, but I looked into the Greek, onto the word see, and sort of sad to report, there's nothing exciting about this word. It's just see. You know, I see a tree, I see Ron, I see God. I mean, that's this Greek word just doesn't seem to have much spirituality to it. Yeah, David.
We haven't said our motto for a long time, but our motto of worship that we use often in church here is truth. Worship spawneth from the heart, not from the lips. And with that said, God knows the posture of your heart.
Yes.
And it fits real well with the pure in heart. I mean, so we tend to look at worship externally, but it's really an internal thing.
It is.
In the heart.
It is totally an internal thing.
Yeah.
And in fact, I've got a slide from St. Augustine that hits right on that point, how internal it is. Yes. But getting back to, Buck.
You know, in English, it also can mean understanding.
Yes.
I see what you're saying.
I see what you're saying.
I can understand that.
Yeah, and there, I'm sure there are, like I've said before, I am not a Greek scholar. Do not quote me on anything Greek. Okay, I've got Greek resources that I can read. So that's the extent of my Greek knowledge. But what the resource I looked at this week, in the New Testament, the Greek word that's used in this verse is used about 28 times in the New Testament, and oftentimes it's just a very mundane, Jesus saw John or something. It's just, I see Todd in the back of the room. So that's just nothing to it. Interestingly enough, this particular Greek word does not appear at all anywhere in the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament. Now, there are other Greek words for see that do appear in the Septuagint, but this one that Jesus uses here, I searched, I could not find it anywhere in the old Greek Old Testament. So I'm not sure that there's anything, there's no there. I mean, there's nothing. It's just, I guess if I were talking to myself, which I do all the time, I would say don't make too much of this. They will see God. Okay? The key here is that being pure in heart is what makes us and helps us to see God. And we'll talk a little bit more about seeing God as we go along this morning. All right, so to move on, there's another passage over in the Psalms that picks up on this purity of heart. And that's Psalm 24. That is a well-known passage. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? And here we see it. Those who have clean hands and pure hearts, who do not lift up their souls to what is false, and do not swear deceitfully. And this is a neat passage in that it sort of expands a little bit on what this purity of heart can entail and can include. Not necessarily what it means, but simply what it can include. So he talks about people who have pure hearts, but then he talks about not lifting up your souls to what is false and not swearing deceitfully. And in John Stott's book, The Message of the Sermon on the Mount, he picks up on this passage and looks at this and helping to understand the purity of heart that Jesus is talking about. And here's what Stott has to say about the pure in heart. In their relations with both God and others, the pure in heart are free from falsehood. So the pure in heart are those whose whole life, public and private, is transparent before God and others. Their very heart, including their thoughts and motives, is pure, unmixed with anything devious, underhand, or sordid. Hypocrisy and deceit are repugnant to them, and they are without deceit. Wow. How many of us can say that that describes us? Their whole life, public and private, is transparent before God and others. I used to tell my employees when I was working up in Ohio and in my job in the city government, and email had come out. I made that transition from writing by hand on paper to using email. And I always told my employees, if you don't want to see it on the front page of the Beacon Journal, the Akron Beacon Journal, that's our local newspaper, don't write it in an email. Okay, I said that in part because government emails are public property or public sources. Yes.
Isn't it funny though that when we have children, they're so quick to just say things, and they don't think on that. I mean, their heart is. It's not pure, but they're transparent. They're transparent, and we learn. Someone told me that when I became a Christian, and I just wanted to. I was so excited about becoming a Christian, and I would just tell everybody about myself and the sins of my life and all kind of things. And he said, you know what? Most people don't want to be like that, Bob. That's not how most Christians are, And so. It was interesting that he said that to me. Yeah. It's an interesting dynamic in trying to figure out in life just
how transparent do we want to be? You know, there's a reason why we can't read each other's thoughts. I remember there was back when our kids were young, Focus on the Family, I think it was, had an audio radio type series, Adventures in Odyssey. Mm-hmm. And for us, it was a half-hour drive from our house to church, and so we listened to an episode every week on the way to church. And there was this one episode in which one of the kids in Odyssey Land got the power to read other people's thoughts. And that just turned into an absolute disaster, as you can imagine. Because, I mean, you know, there are thoughts you don't want to share with the world, okay? And there are thoughts you don't want to know what other people are thinking. I've been sitting out there. I know that by the time we get to about 10:05, many of you are going to be thinking about anything except the pure in heart will see God. Okay, our minds are going to wander, and I get that. I sit out there too, and so there's going to be a lot of interesting thoughts, and you know, not necessarily. I don't know how transparent we want to be in that sense, but
you know, I think it's really the result of sin that we lack transparency. I think in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were totally transparent with God before they sinned,
right?
And then they began to hide. And I think a lot of us hide ourselves, which pulls us back from having more meaningful, real relationships, because we know ourselves. It's like many people attribute to me righteousness that I don't have, because of what God has done through me in my profession, my career. That it's much less than they think. And that I've learned, though, that I shouldn't hide.
Yes.
That there's no question that I'm afraid to answer. There are questions that I hope no one asks.
Yeah. David, was your hand up?
I was going to say the exact same thing as he did, but I wanted to add, if you've ever seen that movie Avatar,
okay,
the humanoids, they put their hand on the other person's heart and they say, "I see you," which was a sign of transparency, you know.
Yeah.
No deceit.
Yeah. Bruce.
I think it's a very important point to add that I made, that God can read our thoughts. He knows our hearts. He knows our heart better than we do. But the enemy will always attack us, no matter how pure in heart we are. The enemy will never give up. He's always knocking on the door, always prodding. And he gives us those thoughts we shouldn't have. As Paul in Romans said, I don't know what I ought to do, but I don't do it.
Yep.
That's why I don't share some of our thoughts, because it didn't come from God that came from them.
Right. It's just, I don't know. This, like I say, this is an interesting interesting dynamic that I'm wrestling with in my own heart. You know, the transparency before God and others. I mean, I guess, you know, the idea here is that if you are pure in heart, as Jesus is talking about purity of heart, then, as the old saying goes, you got nothing to hide. And so it frees you to be transparent. And it's not that your transparency is what makes you pure in heart, but your transparency is the result of being pure in heart. Just as an aside, last night, and this really just happened. Last night, as I was laying in bed, I started reading an obscure book by George MacDonald. It's called The Flight of the Shadows. It's not one of his more prominent books, but I've got it on my Kindle. And a lot of the theme of this book is about keeping secrets. And George was all about not keeping secrets. And he says this, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide on it. Like I said, I literally just read this last night. He says, "No one who loves and chooses a secret can be of the pure in heart that shall see God." Now, obviously, you know, context is everything. I'm sure that there are times in life when you have to keep a secret. But in this context, the idea that The pure in heart have nothing to hide, so we can be transparent. So if we find ourselves loving to keep secrets, at least what George is challenging us with, no one who loves and chooses a secret can be of the pure in heart that shall see God. I don't know, that just sort of challenged me. And I guess what I want is in my own life to have such purity of heart that I don't feel like I have to keep secrets. And that's, I guess that's where I want to end up. Yeah,
but that's where pure liberty is in not having anything to hide, not being afraid of meeting a person or getting a phone call. Then you're free. But as long as you're trying to hide it,
yes,
you're not free. Because
right,
as soon as that happens, you drip with fear
right,
of being disclosed. So
right.
it's kind of a, I don't know, contrary situation. Our liberty comes and the freedom comes from having nothing to hide, but the flesh tells us we have to hide everything that might not be acceptable to man of God.
That what you just said might not be acceptable to man. I mean, how many of us, I'm sure, you don't have to raise your hand because I know every hand will go up. How many of us are afraid that if people knew who we really were, they wouldn't like us? Okay? And that's, you don't have to raise your hand. But if you want to talk, if you want to talk. Okay, Ron, I like you. I know who you are. I like you.
No, but it involved in being forgiven and cleansed as one comes to Christ. There's just, well, I know that there's counseling and stuff, and everybody wants to tell everything that they did and everything. But there's a blessing in knowing that I've been forgiven. That's in the past.
Right.
I'm not doing that again. And it just makes, I don't know, to express something that's been forgiven under the cross and everything is part of the freedom that I think it is in coming to Christ.
Right.
We're a new creature in Him. And there's things I've done that are shames. Now everybody's going to wonder what those are. But no. But anyway, in that forgiveness comes, even in God, He forgives us. He separates us from the east and farther west, separates them, and they're buried.
Right.
He may not forget. Praise
Right.
the Lord.
Right. Right. And to that point, we are forgiven. Yes, we want to live our lives in such a way that we need to be transparent. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily beneficial for me to stand up here and tell you about 60 years of my sins in order to be transparent. You don't need to hear that. It would not edify you. That's why even Paul says, don't even talk about the things that people do. I mean, transparency here isn't about airing out all your dirty laundry just for the sake of being transparent. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is living a life so that people can see who you really are and you're not afraid for that. Buck.
An element of that is with forgiveness, we need to also understand God's acceptance
Yes.
of us. This morning I was praying in my quiet time, and I would love to thank God that He's always accepted me.
Yes.
There's never been a time when He didn't love me, even though I wandered off for 30 years in the deepest sin and still struggle with elements after I was saved. And His acceptance of me isn't subject to what anybody else thinks. The world can think I'm the biggest stinker, but God accepts me.
Yep.
He always has.
Yep. Yeah, Bruce.
I'm not sure anyone's ever heard of Celebrate Recovery. I went to Celebrate Recovery a few years ago. It's a wonderful process of cleansing. And part of that is to have a trustworthy accountability partner with which you can reveal all the past sins. It's a huge healing process to do that. To reveal everything to one person.
Okay.
All the trust is an accountability partner.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the whole idea in the Catholic tradition. I'm not necessarily talking about confession, but in the monasteries, the monks have their advisors, their confessors, that one person that they share everything with, and that's part of that tradition. MacDonald, in this book, he has another thing that he says here. He says, half the misery in the world comes from trying to look like what one is not. Half the misery is we just put on masks. We put on masks, and another writer, I think it was Stott, I'm losing track of all the people I'm reading here, but one of them says, you know, we put on a mask for each occasion that we're in, a different mask, so people will see us as we want them to see us. And after a while, we forget which mask we're wearing. And, you know, it's just so much easier just to drop the mask, be transparent, and see who we really are. All right. Last week, we got to this quote, and I'm going to put it up here again because I wanted to springboard off of this. This is where we ended last week. This is from Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. And I just love his pursuit of purity. This made me resolve to give my all for the all. So I gave myself wholly to God, and as payment for my sins and out of love for him, I rejected everything that was not he. I began to live as if he and I were alone in the world. I worshiped him as often as I could, keeping my mind in his holy presence and recalling it as often as I found it wandering from him. And so this was Brother Lawrence's practice. This was his goal. He wanted to throw off things, as he puts it, everything that was not he. Not because all this stuff is sinful or evil, but it's just not God. And his purpose, his aim was to pursue God wholly and singly, with a singleness of heart. And so that was where what he did. And he ended up basically practicing the presence of God. He was the monk of the kitchen. He spent about 15 years washing pots and pans and cooking for the monastery. He was a lay monk. He was not a scholarly monk. Okay, you got the Martin Luthers of the monk world, who were the scholars, the teachers, the doctors, and they were the ones who did all of the studying and the translating and everything. And then you had guys like Brother Lawrence, who simply provided everyday life support for the spiritual guys. And Brother Lawrence was the lay monk. Yes, he had specific times when he's supposed to retire to pray. He said he didn't like doing it. He would rather pray while he was washing dishes than go off to his prayer closet and pray. And what he found was, okay, I'm in the kitchen. So is God. I can be with God in the kitchen. Okay? I can be with God in my office, wherever my office is, or in the factory, or wherever I'm working. Okay, I can be with God, and God is with me. N.T. Wright had an interesting way of putting this, and I never really thought of it this way. Right now, as we sit here in Habersham County, state of Georgia, on the planet Earth, point to heaven. Where's heaven? Oh, you guys are too spiritual. Okay. Okay? The Bible says Jesus prayed and he looked up to heaven. Okay? He looked up to heaven. Wright points out, as most of you already figured out, that heaven isn't necessarily a place out there. It is the dimension in which God lives. Okay? Right now, there's a split between heaven and earth. That split will be joined together in the age to come, Revelation 21 and 22. But right now, there's the separation. It's not a spatial separation. It's not that heaven or earth is here and heaven's way out there. I don't know how far you have to go, beyond Mars or Jupiter or whatever, but it's not that. But there's a separation, and yet God's heaven in which he dwells is real close. There's a separation, but it's real close.
Oh, he's in us.
Yes.
He is within us.
He is within us.
Heaven is within us.
Yes.
We are connected all to all because he is in us.
Right.
So we don't come to church to meet with God. We bring God to church to worship him.
Yes. Great way of putting it, Buck. Great way of putting it. And so, this practicing the presence of God, we got to change the way we think, in that, you know, God's not out there and we're here. And, you know, as David says in Psalm 139, you know, where can I flee from your presence? He's not saying that because he wants to get away from God. Okay? He's saying that because, hallelujah, he can't get away from God. Bruce.
God lives outside of or exists, we use that word forgiven for using the word exists, outside of our dimensions of length, width, and height and time. He lives outside of that. And the spiritual bound within those limitations, those 4 dimensions, which don't limit him at all.
Right.
That's why he's eternal.
Right. It just needs stuff. But anyway, the presence of God. What Brother Lawrence is doing here is he's recognizing what's already true. God is present with him. And if God is present with him, as he puts it several times, it would just be downright rude to keep ignoring him the way we do.
1 Corinthians 6:17 says, he who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him.
Yes.
So it is a mystery. You know, how does this work? It is a mystery, but somehow the image of God in which we're created contains an element of spirit.
Yes.
1 Thessalonians 5:23, body, soul, and spirit. And so it is a mystery, but somehow when we're saved, we are joined together with God's Spirit and live with Him from then on in that dimension as part of our life. And that's what we struggle to understand.
Right. Now, how can we, how do we find the motivation to live the way Brother Lawrence is talking here? To truly practice God's presence, to be aware of His presence. I mean, how often do we find ourselves, you know, kind of, you know, in trepidation of God's presence? Okay, Susan, what were you going to say?
Just this morning, he was inviting me, just use your imagination. I'm right here, so imagine me right here with you. Use your godly imagination. And so as I was walking, I was like, instead of thinking about him, having a conversation with him and changing the way. So in my imagination, he's like, let's sit at a table together.
Yes.
So he was sitting across from me. He's like, how would you speak to me? Not as the waiter, what do you want? And I'll give you a tip if I like what you did for me. But if you and I are in deep conversation, talk to me like that right now this morning. And so I think using that, for some of us, a sanctified imagination.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
A few moments ago when you mentioned about Brother Lawrence, about in washing dishes, he feels he's in God's presence. Connie commented on in the garden.
Yeah.
Every time she goes out to the garden to plant seeds or whatever, her mind's drawn to think about God and to thank Him for this and the opportunities.
One of the things that Brother Lawrence pointed out on this next slide is that we should feed and nourish our souls with high notions of God. When I first read that 20 years ago or whatever, that just really gripped me. Because if you recall, last week I made the comment that in the beginning, Brother Lawrence, like many of the monks before him and after him, scared to death of God. Scared to death. You know, go tell Martin Luther in the monastery that you can practice God's presence every day. That would have terrorized Martin Luther. It would have terrorized him to think of practicing God's presence, because he was scared to death of God. Brother Lawrence was too. For 4 years, he was absolutely convinced that he was going to burn in hell forever, even after becoming a monk. He was convinced of it. So many of these guys became monks because they were terrified of God. And they thought that by being a good monk, they would appease God's anger and satisfy Him. And in fact, that's one of the things that prompted Brother Lawrence. For 4 years, he was convinced. Okay? And there was no way that he could set about practicing God's presence if he was constantly afraid that God was angry with him, or disappointed with him, or any of those negative verbs. And so it got to the point where he had to realize, you know what? God does love me. He had to feed his soul with high notions of God. High notions of God. The truth of who God is. Okay? The God of the Bible is a good guy. Okay? He's not lightning bolts and thunder. He's not like what C.S. Lewis put it. He's like a big thumb about ready to squish us every time we're about ready to have fun. Okay? That's not who God is. And it's important for us. And what I learned was how important it was to just simply meditate on the goodness of who God is. I took all those wonderful passages, like Romans 8, that I'm convinced that neither height nor depth nor angels nor principalities, etc., 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 shall separate us from the love of God. Okay? And passages like that, Paul prays that the Ephesians will know the height and depth and length and breadth of the love of God. And I started meditating on those passages because it was so important, because my natural inclination is to feel God's disappointment. That's just my personality. You could probably talk to psychologists and they'll explain why this is. It's all my parents' fault, whatever. But my natural inclination is to feel God's disappointment, and I have to work at meditating on the truth of His love. And I'm thankful for the scriptures that give us that opportunity. All right, so here's how Stott sums it up in terms of actually turning the corner and seeing God. Only the pure, that should say only the pure in heart. That's a typo on my part, I apologize. Only the pure in heart will see God. See Him now with the eye of faith, and see His glory in the life of the world to come. For only the utterly sincere can bear the dazzling vision, in whose light the darkness of deceit must vanish, and by whose fire all pretense is burned up. Wow. Think back to last week, talking about Catherine of Genoa, one of the mystics who wrote about the purifying fire of God. And the Eastern Orthodox have a neat view of the love of God, in the sense that they say that the love of God for the pure in heart is a dazzling light. It is a wonderful light. But for the impure of heart, the love of God is a purifying, consuming fire. When Hebrews says that my God is a consuming fire, in a weird sense, that's a verse of comfort, because that consuming fire consumes away the impurities within us. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. MacDonald has a whole sermon entitled The Consuming Fire. It's a fascinating sermon. It's in his volume of Unspoken Sermons, his first volume. And it's just an amazing sermon. And usually when you read our God is a consuming fire that fills your heart with dread and terror, it's a verse of comfort. It's a verse of comfort, because we need a consuming fire. We need something to consume the dross within us, so that what is left is the pure gold. Yeah, David.
That word sincere in French comes from a French word sincere, which means without wax. And the people used to make masks out of wax.
Oh yeah.
So
Wow. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, and
that's neat.
It goes right along with this consuming fire, because it'll kind of melt the wax away from you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that is such a great image.
Where did he say?
He says that comes from the French word sincere.
Yeah, sang means without,
Without.
seer means wax.
Yeah, I flunked French, but I did pick up that sans means without. And so, yeah, and then cire is wax. So without wax, they used to make masks out of wax. So sans cire is without the wax, without the mask. What's left is, oh, that is
It's
so
like
cool.
Madame Trousseau's wax museum in France.
Yeah.
Paris, and they're all made of wax, but they're not real.
Right. That is so cool. That is so cool. Okay, so let's go to St. Augustine. Here's what he has to say. This goes back to what David was talking about, the eyes of the heart. How foolish are those who seek God with these outward eyes, since he is seen with the heart. Now keep in mind, I mean, with the early church fathers, they spent a lot of time trying to understand the relationship between this material world and the spiritual realm. And for them, they spent a lot of time talking in very material terms that we might not even do. They struggled with, am I going to see God with this physical eyeball? And that's what Augustine's talking about here. And he says, how foolish are those who seek God with these outward eyes, since he is seen with the heart. As it is written elsewhere, and in singleness of heart seek him. Here he's quoting from one of the apocryphal books, Wisdom 1, chapter 1. I've got the whole quote here on the next slide. For that is a pure heart, which is a single heart. And think about that. Think of all the distractions. We talk about distractions. Talk about all the things that invade our hearts. And all the things, okay, we've got God over here, but over here we've got all these other things that invade our hearts and take up our time. Many of them, there's nothing wrong with them. I can't look at them and say they're sinful, but sometimes they just distract us from the main thing or the main person. Let's see that quote in context. This is from Wisdom, the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 1. Again, this is one of the apocryphal books. Didn't make it into the Protestant version of the scriptures. Love righteousness, all you who are judges of the earth. Think of the Lord with a good mind. Seek him in singleness of heart, because he is found by those who don't tempt him and is manifested to those who trust him. And it's just, a neat proverb, so to speak. And I just love that phrase, seek him in singleness of heart. In singleness of heart. And when we talk about this, last week we were talking about, look at John 15, and God is the vine dresser and we're the vines, and he prunes us, he cleans us, and this is ultimately the work of God, and yet there is the work of us, that we take part in this work. We don't just sit back on our couch and wait for God to purify us. We have a role in this, and at least what this is suggesting is seek him in singleness of heart. It almost reminds us of Matthew 6. We'll get there in a couple, 3 or 4 months, where Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness. He's telling us to do something there, to be active, to be actively pursuing and seeking his kingdom. And then Peter, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
A quote from the scripture that did make
okay.
an encouraging quote is 2 Chronicles 16:9. It says, for the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him.
Yeah.
So we just have to decide we want our heart to be loyal to God because he's looking for us.
Yeah. Yes. He's looking for us. Keep in mind, he is looking for us. Okay? I'll say this till my dying day. In the garden, God did not turn his back on Adam and Eve. They turned their backs on God, and God says, where are you? He went looking for them. He goes chasing after the lost sheep in the parable of the 99 sheep. He's pursuing, he's constantly pursuing the sinner. He's not turning his back on sinners. Purity through obedience. Here's what Peter has to say in his first letter. You have purified your souls by obeying the truth in order to show sincere mutual love, So love one another earnestly from a pure heart. And so there again, Peter is telling us our part. We have a part in this. We have a role in this. Okay, again, we're not passive observers just waiting for God to do his work. Okay, we need to obey what we already know to be true. And as we do that, we take part in the purification of our own souls. Paul, over in 2 Timothy, he gives us the what not to do and what to do. Flee from youthful lusts, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. Pure heart. And here, yeah, I like what he's telling us to do. Yes, we flee from youthful lusts. But if that's all we do and we leave it there, that's it. And we'll end up failing. Okay, there's an active, affirmative pursuit of righteousness here. As we pursue righteousness, those youthful lusts take care of themselves. Okay, the faith, as we pursue righteousness and faith and love and peace, okay, essentially that's how we flee the youthful lusts. Yeah, Joy.
One short little, and maybe everybody knows this already and realizes it all the time, but love is not a special way of feeling.
Yes.
There can be somebody in our church body who drives you nuts. And then what usually I would find is when I act out of love and caring, even then the feelings of love will arrive later.
Yes, yes. I mean, total rabbit trail, but you open the door, and I've got some time. We talk about the different Greek words for love, and I've done a lot of studying on these Greek words, and there are a lot of neat writings about them. C.S. Lewis has his book, The Four Loves, is very helpful. William Barclay has written about them. And we got the eros love, we'll just set that aside. That's the sensual, passionate love, which that word actually does not appear in the New Testament at all, ever. In fact, I went looking for it in my New Testament Greek dictionary, and you don't find it because it's never used in the New Testament. But then you've got the phileo love, where we get Philadelphia. It's often talked about the brotherly love. William Barclay refers to that as the emotional love, what you're talking about, the feeling love, the love of the feelings, phileo. It's the love of the feelings. He says it comes upon you sometimes unbidden. You feel what you feel. Okay? When I say I love chocolate chip cookies, that's a phileo love. Okay? When I say I love a possession, that's a phileo love. Okay? But then the agape love, as Joy points out, that is not an emotional love. Okay? It is a love of the will. It's a love of the choice. Okay? That's the love that's commanded. Okay? The Bible never commands us to have phileo for people. God doesn't command emotions. He commands our choices. And the agape love that Jesus commands us to have for one another, new commandment I give you, that you agape one another. That is a choice. And that is a choice that we make. It's a choice to put somebody else's needs above our own. It's a choice to look out for somebody's best good, no matter what effect it has on us. And that is a choice. The phileo and the agape feed each other. They work together. Okay? This isn't a compartmentalizing, agape's over here and phileo's over here, and never the twain shall meet. No, this is more of a spaghetti. They intertwine, they work together. But yeah, I mean, you can have agape for somebody that you don't like. You're not going to have phileo love for somebody you don't like. Okay? But you can have agape for that, and Jesus commands us to have agape for that person we don't like. So thank you for bringing that up, Joy. He's telling us to pursue righteousness, faith, agape love and peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart.
It's really a faith love.
It's a faith love. It's the love that we can have because God first loved us. I mean, you know, study agape love throughout the New Testament, and your eyes will just be astounded by what it has to say. Yes.
Agape love is really a sacrificial love.
Sacrificial love. It's, you know, it's the love that makes you reach out to the guy who's been beaten and rubbing you the wrong way, but also the guy who's in the gutter who just got beat up by the robbers. It was the love of that Samaritan who took care of it. But you know, to say I feel agape love, that would be a misuse of terminology. You choose agape love. You feel phileo love, and so that, again, that's just my rabbit trail. Okay, so as we pursue righteousness, as we flee the youthful lust, as we pursue the righteousness, faith and love and peace, then we get to the point where, as the Orthodox Study Bible says it, when the soul's only desire is God, and a person's will holds to this desire, then that person will indeed see God everywhere. And I just love that. You know, you see God in things that may look like totally irrelevant to life. You just see God in all your activities, whatever you're doing. This hit me when our kids were younger, and our daughters got involved in gymnastics. And I didn't realize what a totally different world it is. You get into the gymnastics world and it just consumes your life. And one of our daughters was heavily into gymnastics, and you know, we planned our summer family vacations out of gymnastics meets. We went to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. We went all over the place to these gymnastics meets. And yeah, you know, at some point in time, you know, this was with the YMCA, and with the YMCA, before every gymnastics meet, they would have prayer, and they would they asked me to lead the prayer at some of the meets, and that's why I started thinking about, you know, this is gymnastics, you know, what are you going to pray about in gymnastics? And as I thought about it, and I realized what was happening here is these girls, you know, all involved, they were expressing the talents, the skills that were given to them by God. And every routine, every balance beam routine, every routine on the bars, everything that they did, whether they intended it or not, worshiped God. When you could, you know, see them performing a back handspring on the 4-inch beam, and praise God that they didn't kill themselves, but praise God that He gave them the ability to do that. And so those routines, at least in my mind as I was watching it, those routines became praise and worship on the gymnastics floor. And you know, so at least I got a glimpse of maybe what this note was talking about. That you know, we can see the hand of God everywhere. And then Paul wraps it up with a phrase, and I'm not even sure what he means in this. To the pure, all things are pure. But to the corrupt and unbelieving, nothing is pure. Their very minds and consciences are corrupted. What do y'all see in that verse? We're almost out of time here. But he obviously isn't saying to the pure even sin is pure. He's not saying that. But yes, Connie.
When I see that, I see one who sees the best in everything.
Yes.
Always looking for the better side of the situation.
Yeah, he says something similar to this over in Romans 14 when he's talking about eating meat or not eating meat. And he says, basically, to the clean, all things are clean. You know, he says, I'm convinced that all things are clean. The meat is clean, everything from God is clean. But there are some people who look at that meat and say, that's evil. Allison.
It makes me think back to seeing God.
Okay.
And like you go into different situations in life and you see different things, and you might see, like, you go to a bad part of town and you just see all of the corruption and evil, that kind of stuff. And one person may only see that, but then another person may look around and say, okay, I see God in certain areas. I see where God is working.
Yeah, that's a great, Mary Kay.
I guess I worked in manufacturing for so many years, and I've been around people that somebody can make an innocent comment, they see something dirty out of it.
Yep.
You see, it's a child, pedophiles see something different.
Yeah.
So I'm looking also at that way and saying, we look at things that are pure, and to me, it's innocent, but somebody else has those vile thoughts, and they look at things, and they put wrong.
Great. Yes, that's a great.
There was an illustration I heard, two salesmen that were sent to West Africa to look at opening a business over there, a shoe business, and the one came back and said, there's no market there, no one wears shoes. And the other one came back and says, there's a great market there, no one has shoes.
Okay, I mean, those are all great thoughts. I mean, the idea that, you know, the pure in heart will see things through God's eyes. And as we see what God has made, we can see them with the purity of his heart. As Mary Kay points out, somebody with a vile mind might see God's creation and think of how to abuse it and stuff like that. And that's, Buck, you get the last word.
I think real quickly that the philosophy of Brother Lawrence can be applied to every one of us in our circumstances. He was in the kitchen, others or mothers will stay with little children, some of us are in the marketplace, some of us, you know, it doesn't really matter. His philosophy, his way of thinking, can be applied to our lives.
Yes, oh, absolutely, yes. Brother Lawrence, what he was talking about, and that's the whole reason that I love him so much. I was reading him at a time when I was struggling with being a lawyer, and I had to learn to see God's presence in my law office and in the courtroom and everything. And I wrestled with that, but I got to the point where I saw it. And I've got I could bore you with a lot of stories, but I won't do that now. Let's close in prayer. Father, we do thank you. We thank you for the purity of heart that you have called us to. We thank you that, yes, by the word that Jesus has already spoken, that we have been cleansed. But we also realize that the purity of heart is not finished yet. So we thank you for the challenge that you've given us. We thank you for the promise that as we grow in purity, we will see you and we will see the world through your eyes. And I pray that for each one of us here, that we will see life as you see it, that we will see the world as you see it, we will see opportunities as you see them. And so, Father, I pray now that you'll go with us into the service, and I pray that you'll be with the worship team as they guide us into your presence to worship you, and be with Pastor as he brings your message. I pray this all